Welcome to Lessons in Consciousness. This is episode 6, where I'm going to take a look at something called out-of-body experiences. Human consciousness leaving the body has been documented for thousands of years and in various forms. One of the most famous ways to have an out-of-body experience is to have a near-death experience. The International Association of Near-Death Studies at IANDS.org actually publishes a peer-reviewed scholarly journal citing many afterlife experiences of people who died and had verifiable out-of-body experiences. What do they mean by verifiable? Well, usually it connotes describing something witnessed while out of body. That would be impossible to know otherwise. Raymond Moody, MD, recounts in his book, Life After Life, numerous stories of people having near-death experiences where they observed activities in their out-of-body state that were later verified by people who were physically present. Now, there's a lot of books out there on the subject of near-death experiences, but one of the more interesting comes from Kenneth Ring, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at University of Connecticut. He co-authored a book with Sharon Cooper called Mindsight. This book is about the near-death experience of blind people. It illustrates that people blind from birth can actually see during their near-death experience. Well, this indicates that consciousness transcends the physical limitations of the body. Now, one of the best documented cases of near-death experience comes from cardiologist Michael Sabom. He describes in his book, Light and Death, a near-death experience that occurred during a brain surgery. The patient, Pam Reynolds, was put into an artificial brain death in order for doctors to perform a complex surgery on her brain. Monitors that were attached to her confirmed that indeed she had no brain activity at all during the surgery. However, Ms. Reynolds later revealed a very detailed near-death experience after being revived from the surgery. She described objects, sounds, and activity in the operating room that occurred during her surgery while she had no measurable brain activity whatsoever. So essentially, she experienced her consciousness outside of her body while her brain was cooled down, drained of blood, and completely non-responsive. Well, this is pretty good evidence of an authentic near-death experience since her brain was turned off and yet she remained aware. If you'd like to explore more on the near-death experience topic, there's a good website called near-death.com. It has a plethora of information, so I think you'll enjoy it. Also, a very good book on this subject comes from Chris Carter and is called Science and the Near-Death Experience. Now, in part 2 of this episode, I'm going to talk about remote viewing. I'm Dr. Bruce King, and you've been watching Lessons in Consciousness. All right. Terrific. It looks like we're on the air, and I'm going to... Sound is good, so I'm going to take my headphones out. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And I'm going to continue giving some more details about the near-death experience. But first, I want to talk a little bit about... let me shut that off. I want to talk a little bit about my own out-of-body experience as a child. Now, can I prove that this was an out-of-body experience? No, but it seemed like it at the time. And let me tell you what it was like. Okay, when I was maybe 5, 6, or actually probably older than that. Come to think of it, I was probably more like 9 or 10 years old. I don't remember my exact age, but I have a vivid memory of floating in the den of my family home when I was about 9 or 10 in a dream, right? I kept dreaming this over and over again. This was a recurrent dream I had where I would float around in the house in, my regular body, and I would just float in the dark den. And the den of my parents' house looked exactly like it would look if everybody was asleep in the house. The lights would be turned out and nobody would be around. And nothing was going on. So it wasn't your usual dream where you have lots of crazy stuff happening or things happen real fast. It was just one thing And it was a recurrent dream. I probably had this dream or out-of-body experience maybe 2, 3, or 4 times. I don't remember, but it definitely was a recurring event when I was a child. And of course, when I grew up, I didn't have any other experiences like that. But I remember having the experience when I was a kid, an out-of-body experience. So maybe some of you out there listening right now have had out-of-body experiences. So can relate to what I'm talking about. And now I want to take a look at a little bit of some of the research and the stuff that's out there. And I mentioned in the video this website called ions.org. In fact, here what I'll do is I'll show you a picture of it. Let me bring that over, and I'm just going to bring this into the view box here, and you can kind of see. This is actually a page I want to look at, but here it is, ions.org. It's actually a great website. They have all kinds of information here about near-death experiences, near-death stories, and lots and lots and lots of information, lots of scientific stuff. So it's actually a pretty cool website. I encourage everybody to check it out. You can see the address here, iands.org. Now, I'm not associated or affiliated with them in any way, shape, or form, but I wanted to show everybody that website, and I'm going to actually read a little quote because I do some really good research on this site, and I want to read from one of the researchers they put, because the problem with the out-of-body or near-death experience is that it's too easy for people to be skeptical about it and say, oh, well, they proved that was just an experience of the brain. Researchers showed that. Well, when you dig a little deeper into the so-called research that shows that near-death experiences are just created by a dying brain, you come to find out that, boy, what their conclusions were had nothing to do with the data or the things that they found in their research. And here's a really good example of that. There was some research done, published in Nature. I won't go into all the details, but basically they were stimulating the right temporal lobe of the brain of this lady who had epileptic seizures and problems. And they basically made the claim that they were able to recreate the near-death experience by stimulating certain parts of the brain. We're like, okay, well, what exactly did they find? Well, here I'm going to read a quote from the article. It says, when asked to look at her outstretched arms during the electrical stimulation, the patient felt as though her left arm was shortened, the right arm was unaffected, and then it says, if both arms were in the same position but bent by 90 degrees at the elbow, she felt that her left lower arm and hand were moving towards her face. When her eyes were shut, she felt that her upper body was moving towards her legs, which were stable. Okay, these are the things that she felt when they were stimulating her temporal lobe, and they said that recreated an out-of-body experience. Wow, okay, that doesn't sound anything like an out-of-body experience. It sounds like they were messing with the sensory mechanism of her brain. So anyway, that's just an example of some of the so-called scientific information out there that shows that, oh, well, near-death experiences are just an illusion or a trick of the brain or a dying brain. Another thing that's put forth that near-death experiences is just a lack of oxygen to the brain. When you're dying, your lack of oxygen causes these hallucinations. Well, any scientist or healthcare professional who's familiar with hypoxia of the brain or lack of oxygen to the brain knows that the brain without oxygen doesn't work very well at all. You're not going to have any kind of vivid memory or any kind of vivid hallucination if you don't have oxygen to your brain. So that's ridiculous. And plus, you're not going to remember it. And that's what they found. When you have hypoxia, your memory is shot. So anyway, that's just some of the things that you have to deal with when it comes to some of the skeptical stuff out there. Actually, I also want to show you another quote here from the ions.org website. And this quote says, the possibility of consciousness existing outside of the brain when the brain itself appears to be dead is for Dr. Van Lommel an especially important outcome of this research. Now, Dr. Pim Van Lommel is a big researcher on near-death experiences. If you haven't heard his name before, you can look it up. Lommel is Lommel, is how his last name is spelled. But there was a Lancet article, which is a British medical journal, which talks about near-death experiences. And at the end of this article, there's a doctor, Dr. Long, who wrote a little note at the end. I want to read this little note that he wrote because it's very interesting and very informative about what is possible or possibly happening according to these healthcare providers. He says, quote, "How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death with a flat EEG?" That's a great question. Very smart. Anyway, Dr. Long goes on to say in this article from the Lancet, he says, "Furthermore, blind people have described veridical perception during out-of-body experiences at the time of this experience." So, in other words, blind people have actually, and I'll show you the cover of the book for that. There's actually a whole book written on that called Mindsight, and I'll show you that in a minute. But there's been documented cases of blind people actually seeing what's going on in the operating room and things that they couldn't know because they're blind. They couldn't see that going in to the operating room or in the hospital where they're, had their near-death experience or wherever they were having their near-death experience. So they couldn't be just repeating what they saw when they weren't unconscious or having a near-death experience. So that's very interesting. But anyway, it goes on to say, near-death experiences pushes at the limits of medical ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. Yeah, what have I been talking about for the last, all the episodes almost about location of consciousness? Consciousness is located outside of your brain. And he goes on to say, there is a theory that consciousness can be experienced independently from the normal body-linked waking consciousness. The current concept in medical science, however, states that consciousness is the product of the brain. That's the big tearing point right there. Is the big debate is between, is consciousness part of the brain or is it outside of the brain? He goes on to say, could the brain be a kind of receiver for consciousness and memories, functioning like a TV, a radio, or a mobile telephone? That's what I've been saying, so I agree with this guy. He goes on to say, what you receive is not generated by the receiver, but rather electromagnetic informational waves, photons, that are always around you and are made visible or audible to you by the brain and your sense organs. In our prospective study of patients that were clinically dead, meaning they had no EEG readings showing no electrical activity in the brain, zero electrical activity in the brain, and the loss of brainstem function evidenced by fixed and dilated pupils and even the absence of a gag reflex. The patients report a clear consciousness in which cognitive functioning, emotion, sense of identity, a memory from early childhood occurred, as well as perceptions from a position out and above their dead body. To answer these fundamental questions, research should be focused on specific elements of near-death experiences, such as out-of-body experiences and other verifiable aspects. Finally, the theory and background of transcendence should be included as part of an explanatory framework of these experiences. In other words, transcendence means that your consciousness is outside of your brain, which is what I've been trying to show through all these recent episodes that I've been talking about and continue to try to talk about that. And I think that's important for us to realize that consciousness is located outside of the brain, because that's one of the major things that's going to change the world. That's why I'm talking about this on the Conscious Resistance Network, because that's it. If you're the consciousness part of the Conscious Resistance Network is very important, and knowing what your consciousness is and what generates it or where it's located, I think is very important. If we stop identifying with our bodies and our thoughts, then the world will change for the better, because then we know that our consciousness is beyond all this physical stuff. I mean, think about how less materialistic everybody would be. In fact, that's what a lot of the near-death experiencers talk about, is how they got much less materialistic after their near-death experience. They figured out that, man, this ain't going with me. Why do I care about fighting, working extra hard to get a little bit of extra stuff and toys when I'm not going to take any of that stuff with me, and I don't really need that. And their priorities change after their near-death experience. What happens is people start to give to others more, be more loving and kind to other people, and realize that's what's valuable in life. So that's why I'm talking about this stuff, because that's what can happen, I think, to us without having to have a near-death experience, if we could all realize that consciousness is outside of the brain. Now, I also wanted to show another website called neardeath.com, which is actually a very good and excellent website. I'm really impressed with it. They have just vast amounts of information. I'll just show you a little picture of it here. Let me pull it up. You can see all these categories. It's near-death experiences and the afterlife. It's near-death.com. And it even has links to the ions.org. So they're not associated with them that I'm aware of. But you can see all this information. They have just categories upon categories of stuff. They have near-death research conclusions, quotes from near-death experts, near-death experience resources, notable near-death experiencers. So if you're really interested in this stuff, I highly recommend going to this website. And once again, I'll tell you, I'm not associated with these people at all, but I really admire what they've done here by getting all this information together on that. I'm just scrolling through all this stuff, but you can see that they have just vast amounts of information that could come in pretty handy. Also, there's a lot of books out there that you might be interested in. Let me see if I can find the one I'm trying to show you. There's a Raymond Moody book. He actually kind of started the whole thing with the book Life After Life. Here, I'll bring that up and zoom in a little bit on it, maybe enlarge it. But this is the guy, it says here, 13 million copies sold. So the guy, but I think it's an old book. It's been around a long time. 25th anniversary, there it says right there, of the classic bestseller. So that's always a good one to start out with if you're not that familiar with the books about life after death, or near-death experiences, I should say. That's one of the classics right there, is Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. And 13 million copies sold. You think people are interested in life after life? I think we are. And near-death experiences are definitely a great way to try to understand what that is. Also, I talked about the blind people that had near-death experiences, which are very interesting. That's a book by Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper. Here, I'll show you the cover of that one. I don't need that anymore. Let me bring that up. There we go. Blow it up a little bit. Mindsight is the name of this book. This looks a little more academic. You can see the cover. Sort of. Sorry, it's kind of not real clear. It's very fuzzy. But anyway, near-death experiences of blind people. So and I haven't actually read this book, but I want to. It looks very interesting, and I think it would be very eye-opening, no pun intended, to read about how blind people saw stuff. That's pretty good proof, and that's really one of the major proofs that near-death experiences are real, is people witnessing things or coming back and telling people stuff that there's no way they could have known unless they'd had a near-death experience. In fact, I'll relate one story. I don't remember where I read it, but it was about a lady who had a near-death experience, came back and told one of the nurses that she saw a shoe up on like the third floor ledge of the hospital, and that you couldn't see it from the street, but if you leaned out the window, you might be able to see it on the third floor. And the nurse went and checked this out, and she went up to the third floor to the area that the person that had the near-death experience told her, and she looked out the window, and sure enough, there was this old tennis shoe that somebody had thrown up there, or somehow had gotten up there, sitting on the ledge where you'd have trouble seeing it. So now, did this person look out the window and see this before they had their near-death experience? I don't know. That's hard to prove whether or not they were lying or not, but probably not. Because then you go and look at books like Michael Sabom's book, Light and Death. Okay, and I'll show you the cover of that book here. And this is the one that talks about the patient Pam Reynolds. Okay, or at least I think it recounts that in this book. He probably talks about other near-death experiences, but this is very interesting because if you remember in the video I talked about, this lady actually had all the blood drained from her brain and her EEG was non-existent. They had to basically kill her in order to do this brain surgery, and they cooled her down, which you can do. I mean, it sounds pretty risky to me, but evidently it's possible to do this because they basically made her brain dead in order to perform this complicated brain surgery on her. So they knew she was brain dead because they had all the measurements and everything, and she had a near-death experience while she was brain dead. So that's pretty good evidence, and if you're interested in the stuff that Michael Sabom writes about, then I highly recommend his book, Light and Death, the doctor's fascinating account of near-death experiences. And here's another guy by the name of Eben Alexander, who's actually, he's a medical doctor. I think he's a cardiologist, actually. And he's more recent. He wrote a book about his own near-death experience. I'll shrink that down a little bit. And he wrote, it's called Proof of Heaven. And what happened to him was he had a real bad brain infection and went into a coma, and I'm not sure if he actually had cardiac arrest, I don't remember, but he talks about his journey in the afterlife, and he was a complete agnostic, or maybe even an atheist. At the time, he had his near-death experience, but when he came back, he definitely was much more spiritual and believed in the afterlife and wrote this book. And it's a pretty neat, nice book and well-written. It's a #1 New York Times bestseller, so, so it's probably a decent book, and I've read it, so I would say it's a good book. Okay. I'm going to get rid of that now. Okay, the validity of all these near-death experiences really lies in the ability to have some kind of external confirmation. In fact, some doctors have been known to put letters or items on top of like the lights and stuff in operating rooms, and when patients say they had a near-death experience, they ask them, well, did you see what was on top of the light? And it's been reported that some patients says, yeah, you had like some colored dots or some letters up there, and they were right about it. So, and I can't remember a specific example of that, but I've heard these stories, so it's just anecdotal evidence right there. And I already told you about the lady with the shoe, and we talked about the skeptics. One thing I didn't mention with the skeptics is the God helmet experiments. This was Michael Persinger, and if that name rings a bell, it's because I talked about him in some earlier episodes with the circumcerebral magnetic stimulator. Well, he also did something with something called the God helmet, which was very similar, which was, I believe, stimulating the temporal lobes of the subjects in the experiments, and he claimed to replicate the near-death experience with this. Of course, the data, like the other data I talked about from the skeptical argument, didn't really show what they claimed it showed. In fact, they looked at the data, and the major symptoms that people had with the God helmets was they felt dizzy and things like that. And nobody really had the type of near-death experience that's real typical, where you have the tunnel of light and your relatives come to meet you and that type of thing. Nobody really had that type of experience with the God helmet. So to say that it replicated people's near-death experiences is really stretching the truth of what the data shows. Also, a guy by the name of Per Granqvist, some Swedish guy, I can't pronounce his name, but he actually recreated the experiments that Michael Persinger did with the God helmet, and he found there was no effect from the magnetic fields. And he even consulted Persinger's collaborator, Stanley Coren, to ensure that they were replicating Persinger's experiments precisely and exactly like he did them, and they got no effect. So that's kind of telling about Persinger's results with the God helmet and claiming that he recreated out-of-body experiences. So so take any of this so-called scientific proof that near-death experiences are simply the brain fooling people into thinking they're having a near-death experience with a big grain of salt, because a lot of times the data that they claim shows this doesn't show that at all. So you got to dig a little deeper sometimes to get the real story. And there's some other books out there. One of them by Morson Perry is called Closer to the Light, Learning from Children's Near-Death Experiences. In fact, I'll read a quote that they have in this book. This is actually a very interesting story. Here, I'll read a quote from the book. It says, quote, let me preface it a little bit. This is a lady who died during childbirth. Okay? All right. Here's the quote from the book. Quote, I began bleeding badly after the birth of my daughter, and I was instantly surrounded by medical staff who started working on me. I was in great pain. Then, suddenly the pain was gone, and I was looking down on them working on me. I heard one doctor say he couldn't find a pulse. Next, I was traveling down a tunnel toward a bright light, but I never reached the end of the tunnel. A gentle voice told me I had to go back. Then I met a dear friend, a neighbor from a town that we had left. He also told me to go back. I hit the hospital bed with an electrifying jerk, and the pain was back. I was being rushed into an operating theater for surgery to stop the bleeding. It was 3 weeks later that my husband decided I was well enough to be told that my dear friend in that other town had died in an accident on the same day my daughter was born. Unquote. Wow. Okay, that's pretty interesting. And there's other stories like that where people encountered people on the other side, so to speak, that they didn't know were dead. And then they'd come back and say, hey, I saw so-and-so on the other side. And people would tell them, oh yeah, they died today or just a few hours ago. So that's pretty good evidence that near-death experiences are real when people meet people on the other side that they did not know were dead. So also I want to mention another book that's very good, a book by Chris Carter called Science and the Near-Death Experience, How Consciousness Survives Death. And I mentioned it in the video, but I wanted to repeat it because that's a very good book because it gives a lot of the science about near-death experience and helps to eliminate any of the issues about the brain fooling people into thinking they have near-death experiences. Obviously, I believe near-death experiences are very real. There's plenty of evidence to show that. And, you know, even though I've never had a near-death experience myself, I believe I've had an out-of-body experience, which is actually the same, similar, I would say. Not exactly the same, but very similar. In fact, I'm going to talk about out-of-body experiences in the next, well, I'm talking about them now, but I'm going to talk about remote viewing, which is a different type of out-of-body type of experience in the next episode. One more story I want to relate. There was a patient of mine who told me about her mother who had died on the operating table, and her mother was Jewish, right? And when she came back from her near-death experience, she told her daughter, that was a patient of mine, that everybody's there. It doesn't matter what religion you are. Everybody's there. So I thought that was interesting, that somebody who was a one particular religion came back and said that actually it doesn't matter what religion you are. Everybody's there. And that's actually been reported by a lot of people in near-death experiences that went to the other side. They come back and say, well, they get a lot more spiritual and a lot less religious because they realize that, no, religion's not, you don't have to believe in Jesus to go to heaven. You don't have to believe in Allah specifically or any particular one God to make it to a better place on the other side. There may be specifics of what you have to go through on the other side depending on what kind of person you were here, but I won't get into that right now. But I thought that was interesting. That's what her mother said when she came back from her near-death experience. That everybody's there. Doesn't matter what your religion or your belief system is. Okay, before I go, I want to thank Neil Rademacher for doing the technical stuff. And also I want to mention, before I forget, about the fundraiser that Derek's doing. It's at Indiegogo.com projects the conscious resistance. Okay. And I'm reading some stuff here. All right. But this is the conscious resistance heads west. So what you would be doing, I'm supposing, is helping to sponsor Derek's trip across the country, and he's going to report on a lot of stuff. So you get a lot of good feedback and a lot of good things. So there's a reward for donating. You're going to get lots of good information. You're going to help sponsor the Conscious Resistance Network. So thank you, everybody, for doing that. And don't miss Derek's show. Be sure to catch it on Sunday nights, usually on Sunday nights, unless there's a technical problem. But there's always great stuff. And if you miss the shows, don't worry. You can watch all the shows in archive. Just go to the Conscious Resistance Network and tell all your friends, too. If you found the show interesting, tell your friends, hey, you can watch this show, Lessons in Consciousness, on that. And you can write comments. In fact, if you didn't ask any questions tonight, which I noticed nobody asked any questions, you can actually put questions in the comments section on the Conscious Resistance Network under the videos. There should be a conscious or a comment area under the videos, if I'm not mistaken, and you can actually comment there, and I will answer those questions to the best of my ability. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for joining me tonight, and I will see you next week when I'm going to talk about remote viewing. Thank you, and good night.